right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Brittany Branyon, and I serve as Director of Cary Center Collegiate and Community Programs, to include the Nonprofit Affiliate Program, currently serving over 120 nonprofits in East Alabama and beyond. Welcome to the second installment of 4 Steps of Donor Fundraising Cultivation. Before we begin, I would like to share a little more about the Nonprofit Affiliate Program for those of you who are unfamiliar. The Cary Center Nonprofit Affiliate Program fosters a community of educators, professionals, organizations, and students who have a desire to embody philanthropy, nonprofit studies, and leadership in their professional and personal lives. We provide professional development and networking opportunities to members to include Mix and Mingles, the Cary Center Volunteer Internship and Career Fair, also known as Meet Me at the Vic, and the Cary Center Nonprofit Summit. In addition to these events, now more than ever, we are focusing on professional development and learning opportunities, to include our summer fundraising series and the Nonprofit Affiliate Book Club. Cary Center Nonprofit Affiliates are the first to learn of upcoming program, and membership is free. I will include information on how to join the Nonprofit Affiliate Program and would be delighted to have the pleasure of working with you, especially as we navigate this challenging time. We are also winding down our survey titled The COVID-19 Effect on Alabama and Georgia Nonprofits, and I will be sure to include that information in the email to follow today's program. Now, let's get to the reason you are all here. Please join me in welcoming back today's speaker, Greg Doepke. Greg is the founder of Aspire to Give, a social enterprise dedicated to unleashing human generosity through donor education, social innovation, collaboration, and advocacy. With over 20 years of experience and credentialed expertise in all facets of financial, estate, and philanthropic planning, Greg is the author of the book Aspire to Give, How to Create a More Meaningful Life Through Your Giving. We are thankful he took the time to join us today once more and share his knowledge and passion for donor fundraising. Without any further delay, please welcome Greg Doepke.
Hey everybody, good to have you back on the session 2 here, and so we'll just jump right into it and cover a lot of stuff. Hopefully we can have some good conversation and good dialogue on this and sharing and caring at the end. But let me go ahead and share my screen and I'll go through it and we'll take it from there. So let me go ahead and share here. Let's see. Okay, here we go. It's and let me go ahead and just get going on this. We're going to talk about the 4 steps of donor fundraising, in especially during the COVID times here. And this is step 2, cultivation. And what we'll talk about really briefly is a format and review, kind of go over what we covered last time. Cultivation, definition and the goals of cultivation, thoughts and needs of cultivation, traditional ways to cultivate donors, and some ideas and for COVID times. And then hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time, 30, 40 minutes, maybe conversation on different topics that come up during this session. So let's look at it a little bit more here. And the format is going to be about 15 minutes of just sharing, and then we'll have some conversation and, like I said, caring and sharing. And it's really, really tough times. We're in a situation with this coronavirus, and we have unemployment, and we have a lot of social unrest. And so we'll talk about all that in terms of cultivation today, but what we've covered so far is identification in terms of the 4 steps of fundraising. Identification, cultivation is today, and next month we'll be asking, and then the asking for funds or for the gifting, and then stewardship. Last time, as we may recall, for those that attended, talked about the importance of having a donor CRM. It's basically a relationship management software that it could be as complex as Salesforce, or which I have used before and is really, really powerful. But for some nonprofits, especially the smaller ones, they may just use a spreadsheet. But in any case, there are some on the market that are relatively inexpensive, maybe $20 a month, or maybe a little bit more than that, that are pretty powerful relationship management that handles, which handles all the important details you'll need for the whole process of donor fundraising. Last time I talked about the donors, and that donors give for their reasons, not yours. You may have the greatest nonprofit in the world, but if the donor can't relate to you and it doesn't speak to their heart, they're not going to give to you. So basically, last time we talked about the discovery state of what I call the appreciative donor education process. And somewhere in the past, or somewhere, there's some kind of passion, even if it's a little one, a little spark, that attracts them to your nonprofit. And ideally, if you address the sweet spot and can find the sweet spot of your donors, which is their passions and causes, their gifts, and that can be more than just money, and they make it fun and joyful for them, then you found their sweet spot. But right now, during fundraising, obviously, we've got all these headwinds of social distancing, financial hardship, and funding. Funding is going to healthcare and maybe away from your own nonprofit, because everybody, the current emphasis is on the healthcare part with COVID. So let's just jump into the cultivation and definition, the definition of cultivation and goals. Cultivation is building and growing the relationship with a prospect or donor. It could be before or after a sale, but it's all, if you have one sale, for example, you raise funds from one donor, you may want to do additional cultivation to actually grow that relationship more. Whoop, excuse me. Okay. And it's all about relationships. Cultivation is all about relationships and being able to have a relationship with the donor. And so the goals of cultivation in this step of the fundraising, there are three of them. You build a donor relationship. Metaphorically, you want your donor to grab your hand and you walk together in the passion for whatever your nonprofit is. The second one is, I call it top of mind awareness, and talked a little bit last time about the thought of maybe smaller nonprofits in a community like Auburn or East Alabama, competing with one another. Well, it's really not a matter of competition, but it is a matter of top of mind awareness, which means that if someone has a choice between charity A or nonprofit A and nonprofit B, and they have equal relationship, if they're top of mind, they're going to think of this your nonprofit if it's top of mind. What reminds them? Are you constantly in their top of mind thinking? It's typically in marketing. And lastly, as I've mentioned it previously in the previous slide, is zeroing in on your donor's sweet spot and focus. So in your cultivation discussions, your conversations, your what I call touches with your donors, you want to find out more and more about them so you can understand what their sweet spot is. So those are the three goals of the cultivation process. And so one of the key points is you have your donor CRM or your spreadsheet or whatever you use to document your communications with your donors. You have to document all this. For example, let's say that you have a conversation with a potential donor, and they happen to mention that their mother or their spouse was a teacher, and they have a passion for education. Somehow you have to document that, because in all the conversations you have with all the people, somehow that will come back and you will need to remember that. And so if having it in your database, your spreadsheet or donor CRM, that will provide a means of knowing your donors better and reminding you about how you can find out more about them. And like I said, it's all about relationships. So let's talk about cultivation needs and thoughts. You know, for this whole part of cultivation, and actually the whole donor fundraising process, we're talking about planning your work and then work your plan. And what do we mean by that? You have to have a donor cultivation plan. And so what does a donor cultivation plan consist of? Okay, are you going to touch with Zoom meetings? Are you going to touch them with newsletters? Or how do you reach out to your donors? And then specifically, what is the purpose of each touch? And once again, I mentioned about capturing information in your database as far as knowing your donors. It's nice to have that to review prior to your conversation, your next conversation, so you can say, oh, by the way, how's education going with your spouse, or whatever you want. It provides a means of bringing up conversational topics, as well as it shows the donor that you are familiar with them and you're building that relationship. And then just talking about working your plan, design and implement the plan. So you have to have the purpose of each donor touch. And what I mean by touch is the actual communication of some kind with the donors to build a relationship and to raise to top of mind awareness. And then the frequency of touch. How often are you reaching out to your donors? And this is part of your overall plan. Do you do it monthly? Do you do it quarterly? Do you do it semi-annually, annually? What do you do at each of those time frames? And then also the frequency of ask to touch. And we are all in this situation. You may be constantly being asked for money, or as an individual donor, to those things that are important to you. So if you're a nonprofit, you don't want to always be asking for money. You want to be having touches with your donors. But a lot of those are just, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? Have you gone to the Auburn football game? Whatever it is. So the frequency of ask to touch in one ratio I saw was 1 to 3. Some of you all may have different ratios, or it may not even thought of how often you are contacting your donors and why are you contacting them, and how often are you asking them for money. And once again, in your database, you have to document all this. So let me throw some additional thoughts as I was developing this little presentation just to plant some seeds with you for thoughts. Once again, it's all about the relationship. So what can you do to enhance and build the relationship? Talk about the database. It is so important to have your database up to speed. Women, men, and couples. Everybody handles things differently. Women approach philanthropy different than men do. Also, if you have a conversation with both a couple, you obviously want to be talking to both of them, because you don't want the other one to go back and say, I was totally ignored. For example, let me give you an example of something. You have a couple, and then the husband passes away, and then in your mail to them and your touch to them, you still say Mr. and Mrs. That obviously is not good, so you have to make sure your database is up to date. You have to be careful on how you talk and how you have conversations with your donors, and to make sure that they are dealt with both equally engaged. Or another example is if you have somebody who's let's say in social work, and her husband, I'll use that example, is a professional, an accountant or a lawyer. And so you're talking to him and you think the husband is the one that makes all the decisions because they are a professional. Well, you need to make sure you engage both of them in the conversation, because they have typically they may both be involved in the decision-making process. Details matter. That example I used of someone passing away and making sure you update the database so it's not Mr. and Mrs. and just however they want to be addressed. and then capture the moment. What that means is, as you're having these conversations, you have to have a way of remembering and capturing the details of the cultivation process. So after you meet with a donor, what do you know new about the donor, and are you zeroing in on the donor's sweet spot? Will the information you've gotten from your conversation, for example, help you zero in on the sweet spot? Traditional ways to cultivate donors. And I'll go through this real quick. Most of you all are familiar with all these, but face-to-face meetings, that's kind of not, we're not doing that these days. Certainly not handshaking. US mail was traditional. Volunteer opportunities, such as a tour of your nonprofit, which is really good because that helps build the relationship with your donors if they can see what the good work you are doing. So that is really good, and traditionally has been very, very worthwhile. Phone calls, traditional gatherings or conferences, such as the Women's Philanthropy Board Colloquium and Symposiums. Those are traditional gatherings that we have, and those in the current environment really are not happening. And then e-newsletters. Maybe you have a newsletter for your nonprofit that goes out to your donors. And of course, social media. We talked a lot about social media the last time as far as identifying and how to identify your prospective donors through social media. But these are all traditional ways of cultivating donors in the past. There may be more, maybe you all have different approaches to all this, but those are the traditional ways, but things have changed. So if we go into cultivation in the new normal, and so I'm just throwing out ideas, can hopefully y'all can have some ideas and share at the end of this. In this new normal, we have to be creative, and we have to consider the risks. And can we make it fun? Maybe be outside and engage tech. And let me go through each of these. Be creative. You got to think outside the traditional on how we can do things to engage the donors and do cultivation and touch our donors, our prospects. We're going to talk about risk. We've got to manage risks. So, for example, the younger folks may not be as at risk to COVID as maybe someone that's 60 or older. So then if you have to be aware of what the risk is to the donor and what they are comfortable with, and then position the cultivation steps that are in line with their risk. So last time, I think in one of previous sessions, talked about managing risk. So that's managing a risk. You have to be aware of that. Can you make it fun? Can you do it outside? Can you leverage technology to be helpful in the cultivation process more so than it has been? So let's talk about what the traditional ways and where they are now in the existing COVID environment. Face-to-face meetings, obviously they're out. E-newsletters, they used to be the rage. I don't know about each of you, but if newsletters are not, they can be counterproductive. It may be better to have something like a link to your website that has the current news instead of a newsletter. Traditional gatherings, we talked about that, that's out. Mail, that's kind of maybe used occasionally, but for the most part is not really used these days for communication with donors in the cultivation process, except for maybe annual reports or significant announcements. Okay, here's phone calls, selective. You have to, once again, as part of your plan as far as cultivation, when do you make a phone call and when don't you? I just speaking briefly on these mediums, you have texting, you have emails, you have phone calls, you have somehow face-to-face, you have video calls, all that. Each has their place in this donor cultivation step. It's knowing what makes sense in the right position and with the specific donor you're talking with. So it's almost a tailoring depending on the preferences of your donors. Do they prefer email? Do they prefer Zoom meetings? Are they okay with texting if you're okay with texting? Volunteer opportunities selectively because of the social distancing. We have to be very selective in volunteer opportunities. So let's talk about a couple others. One thing that I've done down here at the bottom is a walk and talk. Basically, I'm getting zoomed out, as most of you all are getting zoomed out from all these online conferences. So I've said, hey, how about we meet in the park and take a walk on the trail and keep our social distancing, and that way we can have a person-to-person conversation that is outdoors. And by the way, you get a little exercise, and as long as the weather's okay, it works out well. Then there's social media. There's more and more use of social media for the cultivation step. So if you're not highly engaged in social media, you're really missing an opportunity. So bottom line is being creative with your virtual outside gatherings. We talked about sweet spot, having fun and meaning. So how about book clubs as an idea? And if you're going to have a book club and you want to have a book club, a monthly meeting, hey, maybe you could have it in the gazebo, Town Creek Park in Auburn. Just everybody brings their chair and they sit socially distanced, and you're underneath the gazebo and you do something like that. Some way of being a little bit more creative in terms of your cultivation and building top of mind awareness and helping appeal to the donors so that they are attracted to your nonprofit. You can have movies, you can have fun, movies that may be relevant to your specific nonprofit. And if you can make it fun, it's good. Remember, I mentioned about the 1 in 3 touches in terms of asking. So some of these can be those 2 that you're not talking about asking for money or whatever you're asking for. So let's get to the end here as far as the let's care, share, and learn with others, and talk about the importance of the donor CRM, the spreadsheet. Remember, you've got to use that. You've got to be comfortable with it. You've got to be able to have your donor touches, planning your donor touches, and then entering and following the system you have set up for your cultivation step. And also document all the details. You have to dot your I's and cross your T's and make sure that all your donor information is up to date and correct, because the last thing you want to do is call somebody the wrong name or their wrong nickname or addressed in some kind of correspondence the wrong way. So to jumpstart the conversation, and we can kind of go back, I'll leave the screen up, but this is for each of you. What are you doing during COVID-19 to cultivate donors? And are you doing something different? Have you adjusted your cultivation plan, if you have one? Or maybe you haven't, but maybe you're just doing it on the fly and adapting to what's going on. And so I'm certainly open for conversation. Brittany, do you have anything to add? And I'll just I'll leave this up, but we can take it from there.
I think one thing I wanted to add really quickly is it's very important to make sure you mentioned on couples and how you want to make sure that both of them are involved in decision making. So for me personally, my husband's an accountant, so when we talk to financial professionals, or if someone is asking a donation, many times we've had in the past, someone ask him a question about the finances and not me, and it's very direct that they're asking him, when what they didn't know is I'm the person who makes a lot of the decisions when it comes to a certain area of things. So it is important that you make sure, even if I think it can be easy when the spouse who perhaps works from home or works at home as a stay-at-home mom, it may be easy to not think that they are in charge of a specific ask, but you really want to make sure that they feel included. And in addition to that, my husband and I don't have the same last name, and that's pretty confusing to a lot of people down here. And so that can sometimes, if someone were to call me by his last name, I'm like, oh, well, you missed that little detail. That's actually not my name. So pay attention to the details for sure. And go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to answer about what you were doing during COVID-19 to cultivate donors, or if you feel more comfortable answering in the chat, I can say whatever you have typed.
Does anybody have any input or suggestions or thoughts on they want to share with the others so others could learn from each other's experiences in this? How about newsletters? Is anybody using newsletters or change the way they're using newsletters?
I think Jennifer just unmuted herself. Would you like to share, Jennifer?
Oh, you caught that. I was just trying to think through what we've been doing that's different, and it's probably this, in some ways, the same thing everyone else has been doing, which is like for the last 3 months, we've temporarily set aside our normal kind of minimum thresholds for what would trigger a handwritten thank you note, and we're just using this time at home to write our hands off, just writing personal thank you notes to everyone who has been giving. And so that's one way we're trying to connect while we can't be face to face. We also had to cancel one of our events over in Macon, and we ended up deciding we still had a fundraising campaign instead, just a different type of campaign. And we kind of pivoted and used the caterer that we had planned to use for the live event to do some box dinners, gourmet box dinners. And we actually had quite a blast delivering those box dinners to the sponsors of our different fundraising campaign that we did instead. And so we got to have a little bit of a taste of fun, and it was the thing I loved about it in terms of cultivating and connecting with donors was they seemed to love seeing us standing in their front yard after we set their meal on their front porch, and we waved and we chatted at a distance, and they felt special, and they felt like we took the time to really go out of our way to do something nice for them. So, you know, that's just one little maybe different kind of idea. Waiter and Uber Eats aren't the only ones that can go deliver things to donors' doors and wave. So that's an idea.
Yeah. Jennifer, that's a great idea. You bring up two great ideas. One is you're thinking outside the box as far as the cultivation process, because once again, it's all about relationships. But the concept of a handwritten note, I cannot emphasize how important that is in terms of building the relationship and cultivating donors. How many people, of the audience here they're participating, how many of you all get handwritten notes from people? When you do get a handwritten note, and it can be done in just a second, it doesn't have to be a lot. Just say, thank you so much for your donation or whatever. And it has a tremendous impact in building that bonding between the donor and the nonprofit. And by the way, these handwritten notes don't have to be just for when they give money. If somebody has had a brand new baby, I mean, what's better than getting a handwritten note that says, hey, congratulations, I know you're so happy, just wanted to reach out and let you know that we're excited for you. Does anyone else have any input as far as handwritten notes or suggestions or thoughts?
So Sarah mentioned that in the chat. She said we started using a new CRM earlier this year. So this is during COVID. So we have taken advantage of the time we spent working from home this spring to learn the ins and outs of the new system and to participate in trainings like this to improve our fundraising and cultivation strategies. We have also tried to make more personal contacts with donors through phone calls, letters, handwritten cards, as well as personalizing our emails to donors more than we used to. That's awesome.
That is absolutely awesome. And once again, we talk about the touch frequency. I love to get some input from those that are on the call to saying, okay, and just drop in the chat. what is your touch frequency and how often are you asking for money versus having just contacts or touches with your donors or prospects? Do you all have a ratio, or do you have you given it any thought as far as that, what that ratio is, or trying to achieve?
While people are dropping their answers in the chat, I would love for, if Kim is willing, to just breeze through real quick about how one thing that they're doing during COVID-19 to cultivate donors, which I think was entirely unintentional, or maybe I'm wrong, was the event you hosted with Tracy West. Might you share on that, Kim?
Sure. We normally during the summers would be having what we call our Women's Philanthropy Board roundtables. And those were in-person events. So with the new restrictions, we have had to convert all of those to virtual events. And one thing that we have tried to do is to use some of those events to address concerns about COVID-19. And for a lot of people, it's about their children and going to school. And so we have a member, Tracy West, who is on the State Board of Education. So we had a virtual event where we invited Tracy to come on and talk about how the school board, the state school board, is looking at what it's going to look like to go back to school. And we went from having maybe 20, 25 people participate in our online events to having 125. And that the post that we did with the invitation on Facebook ended up getting like 10,000 viewings, which was a huge difference for us. And through that, we were exposed to a lot of new people, and we were able to gather email addresses for all of those new people through their registration. And we were able to add those email addresses into a friends list so that for future educational programs, those people will be invited. And hopefully in our surveys with follow-up, one of the things we asked them within that survey is, you know, are you interested in supporting Women's Philanthropy Board through a membership? So we're hoping that we will identify some new potential members through that as well.
That's so cool. I remember you telling me that, and it was really exciting to hear that. So thank you for sharing, Kim.
Hey, Kim, you know, that is really great. And for all the people that are participating on this call, let me plant a seed that's very similar to this, is that you have this database of let's say a couple hundred names, okay? If you are cultivating your donors, you know something about them. You know something about their job, their profession, what their passions are, here or there. People want to give other than just money. They want to give and get meaning from their giving. So one thought from all this that actually Kim and Brittany are actually in a prime position to do is look through your database of donors and say, okay, who is outside, you know, who has something that's really interesting that could help us not only attract new prospects or donors, but also could really be fun and talk about something. And that is really pretty powerful stuff, because if you tie that into social media as well, and you talk to, let's say somebody has a horse farm, and you say, okay, maybe there's something to do with the farm, the horse that owns the horse farm that could do a program, and actually they would love doing that because it is their passion. And they could have their own network, because part of our what we have is our own personal gifts or our trusted connections, and we don't want to get meaning from our giving. So we give to a nonprofit by helping them, contact with other people. It is awesome. So it's a great way of identifying new prospects as well as helping them, your donors, feel good. And it's kind of outside the box of your normal thinking of, okay, I'm just going to get some money and gifts from. They can reach out to their networks. So that's a great example, Kim, and thank you for sharing.
And circling back to the question that you asked on touches, Laura Ann says they ask, I'm assuming that's for donation once a year. We send e-newsletters monthly, call 2 to 3 times a year, send a handwritten thank you note twice a year, and invite them to 1 to 2 library events each year. That's pretty cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
Laura, can you share a little bit more about that? I'm curious as far as the 1 to 2 library events. So what can you share a little bit more about what that's about?
Sure. I work for the Muskogee County Library Foundation, and we support the public libraries in the Chattahoochee Valley. And so when I know that you're very interested in genealogy as a donor, I call and make sure that you know an event is coming up where you can learn about genealogy.
Thank you for sharing it. And it's really neat if you can reach out. And so you say genealogy, well, then there may be others that are tied to that hopefully through social media, there can be more ways of attracting new prospects, new donors to your nonprofit. So Oslin wrote about what is a recommendation to thank you notes when donors give through Facebook. Does anybody have any suggestions for that? Anytime anybody, let me just first add something and somebody can chime in, is thinking anytime anybody gives anything that's a financial donation, there ought to be some kind of handwritten note. That's my own personal philosophy. If somebody's willing to write a check or make a donation to the nonprofit, then there ought to be a handwritten note. And not saying it's exclusive to just financial donations, but I think my own personal perception and value system is that if you have a nonprofit and somebody makes a financial donation, no matter where it comes from, they should receive a handwritten note, because it first off, it reflects that you care and you appreciate what the donor has done, and second of all, it helps build that relationship. Any other input on that?
So I'm wondering, I think maybe someone else is speaking up. Would someone like to speak up? So I'm wondering with the Facebook, I know Laura Ann said it's hard because you don't get an address along with the donor info. That was my question, is if you got an address with donor info. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert at this, but I'm wondering if it is appropriate to reach out via Facebook and thank them and ask and share that you would like to send them a thank you note or a handwritten card, and if they would share their addresses. I'm not sure if that's appropriate or what y'all think, but
let me just add to it. Brittany, you bring up a good point. This whole concept of Facebook and all is great. Just remember that it's all about relationships, and it's all from the heart. Okay, the heart always leads in this. So if you put yourself do unto others as others do on, that whole perspective, do what is right from your heart, that they would, makes them feel good and is right and reflects your caring and sharing. And I think it's perfectly, from my perspective, I think it's perfectly okay to reach out and say, hey, thank you for making the donation. If you're a little bit interested a little bit more in what we're doing, would you mind sending me? Always ask for permission. I wouldn't say, hey, send me your email. Say, hey, if you're comfortable with it, and you would like to know a little bit more about what we're doing, we certainly would appreciate you, dropping us an email. And you can drop us an email at this address, and have them send you the email instead of asking for it, over the phone or via that. do it in a way that is respectful, that is appreciative of their generosity, and is from the heart. And that's the general guidelines, I would say. Anybody else have some input?
I agree with that. In our programs, if someone has come to programs but they haven't joined the nonprofit affiliate program yet, I'll follow up with an email, oftentimes with other programs we have going on, and let them know if they would like to join our listserv or join the nonprofit affiliate program. They could do it at XYZ, so that they're taking the permission to do that.
Does anyone have any questions of me or Brittany specifically on some of the things we've talked about today? Certainly open to questions. You can drop it into the chat. Let's see, I'm kind of reading the chat. Let's see, is it staff handwritten notes for recognition on social media possible?
Yes.
Let me ask you a question as far as this. I talk about dotting the I's and crossing the T's for your database and all. Have you all run into situations, and are you willing to share with the group here, situations that you say, oh man, I messed up because I did this or that, and if there's something specific that you do or are very conscious of when engaging women and or men and or couples, how do you all handle conversations and making sure things are handled in a very respectful and appropriate and engaging way for both, if the couple is involved? You all have some input? Want to say something? Okay, you just drop it in the chat if you have something. Okay. Brittany, you have anything else that we can move along, or I've mentioned about the dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Talked about
the main thing I would say when and this is just harping on a point that we said before. I had never thought about it until you mentioned it to me, and I know many of you are tracking this, but to make sure you are checking and if one spouse passes away, that you're not sending mail with both of their names or just to the other person, because I know that can be very painful. And also make sure that you're checking names and status of, sometimes people change their names, sometimes their marital status changes, that kind of thing. Those are things that a lot of us don't consider, and it can be very painful to people, and just kind of put them off a little bit. So that's a detail that I would definitely look at.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that whole thing on the research I've done in terms of maybe Sid could actually talk a little bit better than I could on this in terms of gender, dealing with women versus men in conversation. Typically women have a higher desire to give, and that's from a Swedish sociologist, a guy named Lars Tornström, that typically women up until in their 70s typically are more giving, so to speak. And so they are more looking for the emotional attachment to the end result of the beneficiaries. And so that's in terms of the conversation, in tailoring the conversation and the touches with people, that may make more sense, but you have to know, it's kind of like in business, your client, well, you have to know your donor. But on men, it's more a matter of, who's asking me. It may not be as personal. And so the way the conversation goes with men versus women can be different. And you just have to at least recognize that there is a difference sometimes in the conversation. And especially if you have a couple together, you absolutely need to make sure you engage both of them. and that you are not directing your conversation to one or the other. One of them may be there. I had, just to share a quick story with you from the early days of my financial business. I had an engineer come in with his wife. His wife brought a book and read during the meeting because she absolutely did not want to be there. And she actually was showing me that she did not want to be there, but her husband dragged her there. But it was important that she be there because she was listening and she didn't say a whole lot. But when they go back, the couples have conversation. So you need to engage them both. And, you know, one may not be more verbal than the other, and one may defer to the other in conversation, but you need to engage both with open-ended questions. You know, how do you feel about that? What's important to you about this? You know, just questions so to get people talking. So that's just a little tidbit for for you. So anybody else have any questions? I see there's a couple new questions in the chat.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Greg. I have a question for everyone to go back to the newsletter. If you may want to type your answer or maybe speak up if you want to, but we're just now working on a newsletter, and I have in the past, many of you probably received it, and I've put in their registration for different events so you could just click to register. And so I'm wondering, because Greg also brings up an interesting point, I get a ton of newsletters and I don't read them all. Do you, as an organization, find success with your e-newsletter when it comes to not necessarily donations, but engagement and that kind of thing? Hey, Jennifer.
I'll say it really just depends on what the goal is. We mainly use our e-newsletter for communicating information, just so that on our end, we're doing our part to keep our donors updated. We don't generally use those e-newsletters for fundraising. So like when I look at the open rates and the click rates and things like that, they are doing well if those are the measurements. So I know people are reading them, but we really don't use those. Like I said, we're not measuring for dollars from those, but we do send different types of what I would call event promotions that are part of a fundraising campaign. And those we measure for dollars, but those aren't the ones where we're necessarily sending out our quarterly update about that particular program. So whether they open and read them thoroughly is a question I always have, but I know they're opening them and I know they're clicking on the links. I just sort of feel like it's something that we need to be doing on our end. I'm curious about what others are finding as well.
Thank you for sharing on that. A little bit of input. I don't know how the rest of you all are, but I get a gazillion newsletters, and they can be counterproductive because I ended up deleting a lot of them. So first off, if you have a newsletter, please make sure that the people opt in, that they say they want to receive them. And I think most of the constant contact and all that are like that. But also on the business side of things, you know, from what I'm hearing things is newsletters are really no longer the main means of communication. And if you do have a newsletter, a thought may be, look, just put the highlights, keep it short, sweet, to the point, and say, hey, here are the highlights, and then have a link to each one. You know, we have a new initiative, and maybe 3-4 highlights at the top of your newsletter with links so they can read more, so they can just go through all their email and just see it at a glance without having to read through trying to get the information. So that's what I would suggest.
Oslin says that her click rate for the newsletter is usually 20% higher than the industry rate. I don't love it. I kind of feel the same way. It's almost disheartening if I look at the click rate And like Greg said, I mean, I do feel like you can't just put all of your eggs in the new e-newsletter basket. Social media is so important, and I know that Jennifer and all of them do that. But I also agree that you kind of have to send one out to let people know that you're doing your job. And let's see, Sid has a question regarding annual reports. Who is doing an annual report, and what are the pros and cons of an annual report? Is anyone doing one?
We do one. Yeah, I mean, we really have to do an annual report to fulfill our stakeholder requirements, as well as to have the document to send to foundations that give us grant money. So to some degree, it's a formality, but we try not to make the actual document a formality. We try to make it interesting, and I have it sitting right here on my desk. It's nice and colorful, but we use it as a kind of a one document we can hand to people that explain all of the 25 programs of Twin Cedars. And is it something that our donors read cover to cover with bated breath? Probably not. But again, it's sort of one of those things we really just have to do because of stakeholder requirements.
That I love that. I think just from personally, I can't think besides maybe staff and time requirement why you wouldn't. But if you're looking to apply for grants, and if you have a large donor base, you should definitely be putting an annual report together, and you should definitely make it colorful. And like Jennifer has, I know that I got one at a meeting, I think with Child Protect Advocacy Group in Alabama and Montgomery. And I really was actually turning the pages and like looking at it. Of course, I love data, so I was just like, this is so cool. And it was like telling the story. And to me, that was awesome. And if you have that to be able to send to your stakeholders, but also you do need that to show that you're doing your job when you're applying for grants and that kind of thing.
Let me add an additional thing to something Brittany mentioned about stories. And each of the nonprofits has a story to it. And people love stories. And there's a guy out in the business world, a guy named Donald Miller, who wrote a book called Story Brand Script, and he is doing unbelievably well. But so many things that is out in the business world can be adapted into the nonprofit world in so many ways. So if you have stories to share, and they are appealing, and obviously they can be colorful, but people love stories. So I would encourage you to somehow incorporate the stories, whether they be in your annual report, whether they be in your blogs. Someone had mentioned about blogs and that's a good question as far as, do you do blogs? How many of you all do blogs? I'm just curious to know if you do blogs for your nonprofit. Anybody want to share as far as blogs and their thoughts on blogs for nonprofits? I'll share a little bit on my perception of blogs. I do a blog, and simply I do a blog for several reasons. I do one simply for my own developing the own content for Aspire to Give, but I think it also helps build relationships. I think if people can get to know a little bit about your nonprofit through a blog, it's almost like having a conversation, and you get to share with them. But if you have stories you can share through blogs of some kind, then I think it helps build a relationship with prospective donors and your donor base. So it is a way of cultivating. So I think it is. I think it's up to the individual nonprofit or whether you all feel it makes sense for you, because it can be very specific. But there are some good stories out there. So I would encourage at least give it some thought on whether or not you should have blogs or not.
Kim makes a really great comment in the chat. She said, blogs are fine, but you have to be consistent. The tendency is to start, but then they fall by the wayside because people get busy. If you have the time to maintain and create content, it is fine. It is not a good look to have one that has not been updated. I could not agree more. I feel the same way about social media and websites. If you go to, me personally, if I'm going to a website that is not updated and not fresh, I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on? Or a blog, I'm like, oh, well, they don't care anymore. And it's really hard to, with everything we all do, to keep creating fresh content. But if you get an intern, or if you're able to hire someone for marketing and communications, that could certainly be one of their duties, because it does help share your story.
Yeah, Brittany, you bring up a good point. This is great about the blogging, because you absolutely have to keep the content very, very routine. For example, I mentioned in this little presentation about plan your work, work your plan. So I plan to work for a blog to come out every 3 weeks. So I have it in my schedule to set aside a certain period of my time to write a blog. And then I have a process that deals with writing a blog, because that can be challenging in itself. But and if you all want to reach out to me individually for how I do that, that's fine, because I think we're running out of time. But it is important to do it. And like I said, I share it every 3 weeks with a new blog, and I have a process for actually content creation, as well as posting and editing and all that. And you can reach out to me separately if you'd like to learn more about that, on how I do things. You may want to do it differently, but that's the thought.
Thank you. That was great. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. If you have any questions that you would like to send, you can email me at branyba@auburn.edu. All right, and let's see. I'm going to be following up with an email. It's going to have information if you'd like to join the nonprofit affiliate program, if you haven't done so already. And we're doing our final push on our survey. Again, if you haven't filled that out, we would so appreciate it. We're trying to find out the best ways to help you all. And just a reminder that our next program is Wednesday, July 15th. Wednesday, July 15th at 10 a.m. with Noemi Oding, as she presents Applying the KISS Principles to Grant Writing. That is something that I really can't wait to hear more about. And to register, you can email me, or you can respond to the email that I'm going to follow up with. And thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you all have a great day, and hope to see you soon.